The year was 1890. Dust swirled around the hitching posts as Pastor Thomas stepped off the stagecoach, his worn leather Bible clutched in one hand. Dodge City wasn't like his quiet New England parish. The air here was thick with the smell of whiskey, horses, and something else he couldn't quite place, a raw edge that hummed beneath the surface. He adjusted his spectacles, his gaze sweeping over the weathered faces of the men on the street, each one looking like they'd seen more than their fair share of hard times. He walked towards the loudest building, the saloon, its doors swinging open and shut with rhythmic bangs. Inside, the noise was a wall of sound, clinking glasses, a out-of-tune piano, and rough laughter. Then he saw him, a cowboy, a big man with a face like chiseled rock, known around these parts for not flinching at anything. But right now, this cowboy was shaking. His eyes, usually squinted against the sun, were wide and darting, fixed on something Pastor Thomas couldn't see in the dim, smoky light. The cowboy's hand trembled so much he nearly dropped his glass. He was clearly terrified, a stark contrast to the tough reputation that preceded him. Suddenly, a booming voice cut through the din. "Look at old Jedediah, scared of his own shadow." Pastor Thomas turned to see Silas Thorne, a man whose name carried weight in Dodge City. Silas was a rancher, rich and respected, with the kind of influence that made men listen whether they wanted to or not. He was leaning against the bar, a sneer twisting his lips, his eyes cold and dismissive. He gestured at the trembling cowboy with his glass. "What's the matter, Jed? See a ghost? Maybe you've had a few too many, or perhaps that little brain of yours is finally giving out." A few men chuckled, but their laughter sounded forced. Silas's words were laced with a casual cruelty designed to cut deep. He wasn't just questioning Jedediah's courage, he was questioning his sanity, his very manhood. It was clear Silas had no patience for anything he couldn't explain or control. Pastor Thomas watched, his calm exterior unwavering, but a flicker of something hard and resolute entered his gaze. He said nothing, but a silent promise of reckoning seemed to form in the lines around his mouth. As Silas continued to mock the cowboy, a strange thing happened. The gas lamps above them flickered, not just one, but all of them, at the same time. The saloon plunged into a momentary gloom, then the lights surged back, brighter than before, making the shadows dance wildly. A ripple of unease went through the room. Even Silas paused, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. It was subtle, unsettling. Jedediah, still visibly unnerved, slowly turned his head. His eyes met Pastor Thomas's across the crowded room. There was a shared understanding there, a silent acknowledgement of something beyond their control. It was as if a brief, chilling thought passed between them. Some truths refused to stay buried. Then, the heavy saloon doors creaked open. Pastor Thomas braced himself for the midday sun, but instead, only darkness spilled in, a darkness that defied the bright sky outside. From the street, a low guttural sound emanated, too deep, too primal to be human. It vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are watching from in the comments. The ominous sound from the street hung in the air, a chilling prelude to the strange events unfolding in Dodge City. But to truly understand Pastor Thomas's reaction, to grasp the depth of his quiet resolve, one needed to look back, far from the dusty streets of the frontier, to the quiet rhythms of his past. He had grown up in a small, devout New England town, a place where the church steeple was the tallest structure and Sundays were for reflection and prayer. His childhood was filled with the gentle hum of hymns, the rustle of turning Bible pages, and the comforting scent of old wood and beeswax. His family were simple folk, deeply rooted in their faith, and Thomas, even as a boy, displayed a thoughtful, introspective nature. While other children chased frogs in the creek, he would often be found in the quiet corners of the church, tracing the patterns in stained glass, lost in thought about the stories they told. This quiet disposition was often mistaken for timidity, a shyness that set him apart. People sometimes assumed he lacked the fire and conviction of a true leader, but beneath that calm exterior lay a restless spirit, a deep desire to understand the mysteries of faith beyond the rigid doctrines he was taught. He questioned things, not out of doubt, but out of a profound curiosity. He wanted to feel God's presence not just in Scripture, but in the world around him, in the unspoken truths of existence. This intellectual and spiritual hunger often led to quiet struggles with self-doubt. Was his faith strong enough? Was he truly worthy of his calling if he couldn't simply accept without questioning? He harbored a secret dream of encountering something truly extraordinary, something that would test his convictions and deepen his understanding. His journey to Dodge City was, in many ways, a pilgrimage for that very purpose. He hadn't come seeking gold or land, but new spiritual challenges. He yearned to test his faith in a lawless land, where the lines between good and evil often blurred, and where life itself felt raw and untamed. He wanted to see if his quiet faith could stand firm against the harsh realities of the frontier, to see if he could find God in the wild, untamed places where civilization barely held a foothold. He believed that true faith wasn't found in comfort, but in hardship, in the face of the unknown. In stark contrast to Pastor Thomas's introspective nature was Silas Thorne, the prominent rancher who had just publicly humiliated Jedediah. Silas was a man cut from a different cloth entirely, a product of the unforgiving frontier. He had arrived in Dodge City years ago with nothing but grit and a fierce ambition. He'd built his empire from scratch, wresting land from the wilderness, and carving out a fortune through sheer force of will. His self-made success had instilled in him a ruthless pragmatism, a belief that only what could be seen, touched, and controlled was real. Silas distrusted anything he couldn't explain or dominate. He saw the world in black and white, facts and figures, profit and loss. There was no room for superstition, for emotion, or for anything that hinted at the ethereal. His presence in Dodge City wasn't just about wealth, it was about power, an unyielding will that bent others to his command. He was the kind of man who believed he was the master of his own destiny, and anyone who suggested otherwise, anyone who spoke of unseen forces or unexplained phenomena was a fool, a weakling, or a charlatan. This fundamental difference in their worldviews, this ideological clash between faith and brute pragmatism, was about to define their interaction in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The stage was set for a confrontation not just between two men, but between two opposing ways of understanding the world. Silas Thorne's pattern of dismissing anything he couldn't grasp with his own two hands wasn't new. He had a long history of making people feel small for believing in things that defied his logic. Pastor Thomas had heard whispers, had seen the lingering hurt in people's eyes, even before the incident with Jedediah. There was the story of Old Man Hemlock, a quiet settler who swore he'd seen strange lights dancing on the prairie one night, lights that moved with an intelligence that wasn't natural. Silas had publicly scoffed at him, calling him a drunkard and a dreamer, suggesting he was too old to know what was real anymore. Hemlock had never spoken of it again, his gaze always dropping when Silas was near. Then there was Martha, a young woman known for her gentle spirit and her unsettlingly vivid dreams. She'd once spoken of a dream where she saw a fire consuming a specific barn before it actually happened a week later. Silas, hearing this through town gossip, had cornered her in the general store, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he questioned her sanity, suggesting she was seeking attention with witchcraft. Martha, mortified, had become even more withdrawn, her prophetic dreams now a secret she guarded fiercely. Even the native elders weren't spared. Their warnings about sacred land, about places that held ancient spirits, were met with Silas's dismissive snorts and claims of superstitious nonsense that held back progress. He'd bought land despite their pleas, built fences and dug wells, openly mocking their beliefs, saying their spirits must be too weak to stop a good businessman. These were not isolated events. Silas's disregard for anything spiritual or unexplained was a core part of him, a rigid belief system that allowed no room for the unknown. His actions weren't just about skepticism, they were about control, about forcing his worldview onto others. His broken promises were another consistent thread in the fabric of Dodge City life. He would offer to support community projects like a new schoolhouse roof or a well for the common pasture, only to pull out at the last minute if he decided it didn't directly benefit his ranch or his reputation. People learned not to rely on his word unless there was something in it for him. He was a master of subtle manipulation in local politics, always ensuring that decisions favored his interests, often at the expense of smaller ranchers or merchants. He never openly threatened, but his veiled warnings were clear enough. A casual comment about a loan suddenly being called in, or a suggestion that a business might struggle to find customers, was usually enough to silence any opposition. Those who dared to question his authority often found themselves facing unexpected difficulties, their livelihoods mysteriously impacted. These small, constant acts of arrogance and control had chipped away at the community's trust, fostering a quiet resentment that simmered beneath the surface of everyday life. People put up with it because Silas was powerful, because he held sway over so much of the town's economy. But the bitterness was there, growing with each slight, each broken promise. The public humiliation of Jedediah, the cowboy, in the saloon that day wasn't a sudden outburst. It was the culmination of years of Silas's dismissive, arrogant behavior. It was the latest example of his inability to tolerate anything that didn't fit into his rigid, material worldview. Jedediah's fear, his belief in something unseen, was a direct challenge to Silas's carefully constructed reality, and Silas reacted as he always did, by trying to crush it, to mock it out of existence. He couldn't stand the idea that there were forces at play he couldn't control, couldn't explain away with logic or money. That moment in the saloon, for many, was just another painful reminder of the kind of man Silas Thorne truly was. It was a clear demonstration of his deep-seated contempt for anyone who dared to believe in something beyond his grasp. The air in Dodge City grew thick with an unspoken dread. It felt heavier, almost suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on everyone. Jedediah the cowboy became a ghost of his former self. He started talking more openly about the strange happenings on his ranch, whispers of shadows moving when there were none, of his horses spooked by an invisible presence. Silas, of course, found this immensely amusing. He made a point of ridiculing Jedediah in public, laughing loudly about cowboy jitters and ghost stories for grown men. He said Jedediah was just looking for attention, or maybe had too much sun. This only pushed Jedediah further into himself, isolating him from the town even more, making him seem like a fool to those who listened to Silas. But then other townsfolk started to experience little things, nothing big enough to cause a panic, but enough to gnaw at their nerves. A woman swore she heard her name whispered when no one was around. A shopkeeper found items rearranged on his shelves, not by a customer, but in a way that just felt wrong. A pervasive sense of unease settled over the streets, like a cold draft that wouldn't go away. Children reported seeing things in the corners of their eyes, quick movements that vanished when they looked directly. These incidents were usually met with fear, a quiet worry that people tried to hide. But Silas, ever the skeptic, dismissed every single one. He called it mass hysteria, or too much whiskey, or simply people making things up for attention. His unwavering skepticism, instead of calming things, only made the situation worse. It made people feel foolish for their fears, and that frustration just built up. Silas's influence was a heavy hand over Dodge City. His word carried weight, and he used it to shut down any talk of the unexplainable. If someone suggested these events needed looking into, Silas would scoff, saying it was wasting time and resources on superstitious nonsense. He actively discouraged any official investigation. He threatened those who dared to spread what he called rumors, hinting at consequences for their businesses or their standing in the community. His posture became increasingly aggressive, almost daring anyone to challenge him. He tightened his control over the town, making it clear that his version of reality was the only one that mattered. This created an environment where no one dared to question him openly, even if they were terrified. The fear of Silas became almost as strong as the fear of the unknown. Pastor Thomas felt the weight of this silence, this fear. He had listened to Jedediah, had given him a quiet nod of understanding. He had not dismissed the other townsfolk's unsettling stories. For this, he felt the subtle judgment of the community. He was the new pastor, and he wasn't fitting into Silas's mold of how things should be. He could feel the unspoken disapproval, the way people avoided his gaze when he tried to talk about faith or comfort. He experienced a profound emotional suffocation. He was caught between his deep faith, which told him there were mysteries beyond human understanding, and the town's stubborn resistance to anything that defied their logic. All the while, Silas's power loomed, a shadow over everything, making it impossible for truth to surface. The pastor felt a growing desperation, a need to break through the fear and denial that had gripped Dodge City. He knew something was wrong, deeply wrong, and Silas's iron grip was only making it worse. Then things took a sharp turn for the worse. One morning, the entire herd of cattle belonging to Silas, hundreds of them, stampeded right through the main street of Dodge City. There was no lightning, no sudden noise, no obvious predator. They just ran, a thundering wave of panic, destroying fences and scattering goods. People watched in disbelief as the dust settled, leaving behind chaos and confusion. Before anyone could truly process that, an inexplicable darkness fell over the town at midday. It wasn't a storm cloud. The sky was perfectly clear. It was like someone had simply turned out the sun for an hour, plunging everything into an eerie twilight. Chickens went to roost, dogs whimpered, and people huddled in doorways, too scared to speak. During this strange darkness, whispers started to carry on the wind, clear as if someone was speaking right next to you, but with no one there. These whispers weren't for everyone. Only Pastor Thomas and Jedediah the cowboy seemed to hear them clearly. They were not friendly whispers. They spoke of unmarked graves, of broken earth, and unpaid debts. Jedediah, already on edge, looked even more terrified. He grabbed Pastor Thomas, his hands shaking. "It's the land, Pastor," he choked out. "It's angry." Driven to the brink by these increasingly bizarre and undeniable events, Jedediah finally broke. He found Pastor Thomas late one night, his face pale and streaked with dirt, his eyes wide and haunted. He confessed a secret he had carried for years, a heavy weight on his soul. Years ago, before Silas owned the land, Jedediah had been hired to clear a large patch for a new pasture. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, just a job. But as he worked, he uncovered old wooden markers, some carved, some plain. He'd simply pushed them aside, thinking they were just old, forgotten settler graves. He now knew with bone-chilling certainty that it had been a Native American burial ground. He had desecrated it, believing he was just clearing brush. He told Thomas that he was sure now the unexplainable events, the whispers, the angry land, it was all a consequence of his actions. He believed he had disturbed something ancient and powerful, and now it was seeking retribution. Pastor Thomas listened, a cold knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't just about strange occurrences anymore. This was about history, disrespect, and a profound violation. He knew he had to confront Silas. He gathered Jedediah and a few other townsfolk who had also heard the whispers and seen the undeniable events. They went to Silas, presenting the cowboy's confession, the evidence of the stampede, the midday darkness, the whispers. They laid it all out. But Silas, even with all of this, still refused to acknowledge any supernatural element. He scoffed, his face turning red with anger. He called Jedediah mentally unstable, a fool making up stories to explain away his own incompetence. He accused the others of being weak-minded, easily swayed by superstition. He threatened to ruin Jedediah, to make sure he never worked in Dodge City again, to drive him out of town for spreading such dangerous lies. His extreme denial, his furious dismissal, only served to alienate him further from the terrified town. People had seen the stampede, felt the darkness, heard the whispers. They couldn't ignore it anymore, even if Silas could. His power, once absolute, began to crack under the weight of the inexplicable. He became a figure of stubborn, almost pathetic resistance in the face of overwhelming evidence. This revelation, the cowboy's confession, shifted everything. The story wasn't just about things that went bump in the night. It was about something much deeper, the direct consequences of past actions, of cultural disrespect, of ignoring the sacred. Pastor Thomas suddenly understood. He wasn't just fighting an unknown force. He was fighting ignorance, prejudice, and a cycle of suffering that had been set in motion long ago. He realized that to truly help Dodge City, he needed to confront not just the supernatural, but the moral failings that had allowed it to fester. This was the key to breaking the cycle. Pastor Thomas felt a deep tremor go through him. The cowboy's confession, raw and desperate, had laid bare a truth much uglier than any ghostly whisper. It wasn't just about strange happenings. It was about a profound wound inflicted on the land and its original people. He grappled with the implications, the weight of the town's collective blindness, and his own inability to have seen it sooner. A wave of self-doubt washed over him. How could he, a man of God, guide his flock through something so deeply rooted in historical injustice and spiritual retribution? He had come to Dodge City to test his faith, but this was a test he hadn't prepared for. He felt a deep inadequacy, a sense of being overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the spiritual crisis. Jedediah the cowboy now seemed a different man. The burden of his secret lifted. He became an unexpected ally. His guilt was immense, but it fueled a new purpose. He knew the land, not just its trails and rivers, but its forgotten stories, the places where the old ones had lived and worshipped. He started to share these memories, hesitant at first, then with a growing urgency, offering his knowledge as a form of penance. He spoke of ancient paths, of springs considered sacred, of traditions that had been ignored or actively suppressed. He felt a desperate need to make amends, to right a wrong he had unknowingly committed. The townsfolk, once united in their fear and confusion, now fractured. Some, shaken by the undeniable events and Jedediah's confession, began to openly question Silas. They remembered his dismissals, his threats, his arrogant posture, the whispers in the saloon, the dimming lights, the stampede. It all clicked into place. They started to see Silas not as a strong leader, but as a blind, stubborn man whose refusal to see the truth had put them all in danger. Others, perhaps out of habit or a deeper fear of the unknown, clung to Silas's skepticism. They mumbled about Jedediah being crazy, about Thomas being misled, about natural explanations for everything. They feared the implications of admitting something beyond their control, something that challenged their entire worldview. Meanwhile, the Native American elders who had been on the fringes of Dodge City life were now sought out. Some of the townsfolk, desperate for answers, approached them cautiously, asking about the land, about spirits, about ways to appease whatever force was at work. Some elders offered guidance, speaking of balance, respect, and the consequences of disturbance. Their words were calm, measured, ancient. Others observed with quiet judgment, a knowing look in their eyes that spoke of generations of disrespect. They had warned the settlers, had seen this coming, and now they watched as the white man grappled with the consequences of his own arrogance. The deep-seated prejudices that had always existed in Dodge City now stood starkly revealed. The European settlers had built their lives on the land without truly understanding or respecting those who had come before. Native American beliefs had been dismissed as pagan, primitive, or simply ignored. Now faced with something they couldn't explain or control, they were forced to confront these biases. Some saw the events as divine punishment, a wrath from God for allowing such a desecration. Others, more open-minded, saw it as a curse, a direct consequence of violating sacred ground. Each character filtered the unfolding horror through their own cultural lens, their histories shaping their fear and their understanding. The psychological toll on Dodge City was immense. Fear, which had been a constant companion since the strange events began, gave way to a pervasive paranoia. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Trust eroded not just between the townsfolk and Silas, but among themselves. The once stable social fabric, built on frontier resilience, began to unravel under the relentless weight of the unexplainable. Every creak of a floorboard, every gust of wind, every shadow seemed to hold a sinister meaning. People started to see malevolent intent in everyday occurrences. They questioned their own sanity, their beliefs, everything they thought they knew. Everyone was forced to confront their deepest biases, their fears of the unknown, and the uncomfortable truth that their perceived control over their world was an illusion. The town was teetering on the brink, waiting for a way out, or for complete collapse. Pastor Thomas, his self-doubt replaced by a new, quiet strength, understood what needed to happen. He knew words alone wouldn't fix things. It required action, a public acknowledgement of the wrong done. He began talking to Jedediah, to the Native American elders, and then, cautiously, to the townsfolk who had started to question Silas. It wasn't easy. Many were still afraid. Others still stubbornly clung to their old ways of thinking. But Thomas spoke with a clarity and conviction he hadn't possessed before, not just about faith, but about respect, about listening, about the interconnectedness of all things. Slowly, painstakingly, he organized a ceremony. It wasn't a church service, not in the traditional sense, but something much older, much deeper. He envisioned it as an act of humility, a plea for forgiveness, a way to honor the desecrated burial ground. Jedediah, still gaunt with guilt but resolute, stood by his side, ready to confess his part, not just to Thomas, but to the spirits of the land and the people whose heritage he had unknowingly defiled. A few Native American elders, their faces etched with ancient wisdom and careful hope, agreed to participate, bringing their own traditions, their own songs, their own prayers. The day of the ceremony was overcast, a soft gray light filtering through the clouds as if the sky itself held its breath. A small group of townsfolk gathered, a mix of the curious, the repentant, and those simply desperate for an end to the disturbances. They stood on the edge of the land Jedediah had cleared, now owned by Silas, where the sacred ground lay. Thomas spoke, his voice steady but filled with emotion, acknowledging the pain, the disrespect, the blindness that had led them to this point. Jedediah, his voice cracking, openly confessed his actions, expressing his profound regret. The elders then performed their rituals, their chants rising into the still air, a haunting and beautiful sound that brought tears to many eyes. It was an act of profound reconciliation, a bridge being built across a chasm of misunderstanding. Silas, predictably, refused to participate. He saw it all as foolishness, superstition, a further sign of the town's collective madness. He stayed on his ranch, fuming, ridiculing, convinced that his logic and his wealth would eventually prevail. He watched from his porch as the ceremony unfolded, a sneer on his face, oblivious to the shift happening in the very fabric of the town he sought to control. He was an island, cut off, his influence already crumbling. As the ceremony concluded, a strange thing happened. The gray sky, which had been so still, began to darken directly over Silas's ranch. Not over Dodge City, not over the sacred ground, but specifically over his property. A low rumble started, growing quickly into a deafening roar. Winds, unlike any seen before, whipped through his fields, tearing at his fences, uprooting his trees. A localized storm, violent and focused, erupted with terrifying intensity. It wasn't a biblical flood, but a concentrated fury that seemed to target only him. His barns collapsed, his house sustained heavy damage, and his prized cattle, those that hadn't stampeded days before, were scattered or lost. By the time the storm passed as abruptly as it had begun, Silas's ranch was a wreck. He stood amidst the debris, a broken man, financially ruined and completely isolated. His power, once absolute, had dissolved into dust and mud. The townsfolk, watching from a safe distance, understood the message. There was no longer any doubt. With Silas's downfall, the unexplainable phenomena gradually ceased. The whispers stopped. The lights no longer flickered. Dodge City, though scarred by its ordeal, began to heal. The shared experience, the humility of the ceremony, and the undeniable consequence for Silas forged a new kind of community. A new, more respectful relationship with the land and its original inhabitants slowly started to grow. Pastor Thomas, having faced the unknown and found his true calling, dedicated himself to bridging cultural divides, fostering understanding, and nurturing a faith that embraced mystery rather than denying it. The story of Dodge City became a quiet legend, a reminder of the power of acknowledging uncomfortable truths, the heavy consequences of disrespect, and the transformative journey of faith in the face of what defies explanation. It taught them that true justice wasn't always swift or human-made, but sometimes it simply unfolded, revealing itself when people were finally ready to listen.